We are here today, 50 years to the day, from the loss of one of the great yachts of the Western seaboard, to think back to that time and remember the wonderful yacht that she was. Morning Star was special. As a member of also the Los Angeles Yacht Club and the Trans-Pacific Yacht Club, I have personally 3 points of reference to the Morning Star. And she wrote her name large in the annals of Pacific yachting, and probably would have made some points in the transatlantic as well, but we know she didn't make it there. Now, I did learn today, it's an interesting thing for me, one of my predecessors in this role, Bill Raffanti, is here. Apparently, Bill, over here, give us a little wave, because some of us have forgotten about Bill Raffanti, but not all of us. And Bill was joining this club 50 years and a month ago, 1963. So that's 50 years of membership and 50 years of service. Thank you. And these are the kinds of occasions that call that back to us. Morning Star is etched in my mind as one of those great yachts. The people to tell us about that who lived with and on the Morning Star are here today. But I want to acknowledge that I had a senior moment when I wrote out for the main sheet, and I called him Bob McDermott. And he says he has a line for me in relation to that. So, Brian, that's your opening to lay it on me if you feel like it. Please welcome Brian McDermott.
Just after 2 o'clock this morning, it was 50 years to that minute when the Morning Star was lifted up by a huge wave and thrown like a surfboard onto a coral reef 150 miles off the coast of Nicaragua. That's what we're here today to talk about, and also to talk about the extraordinary opportunity we had to go back to the site of the wreck 35 years later, and all the amazing things that happened on that trip. It was extraordinary. Let's start this off with a photograph of Morning Star as a schooner. She was designed by George Owen, who was a very well-regarded naval architect at MIT. She was built in Italy in 1927. You can imagine the magnificent woodwork down below with being built in Italy in that era. Everything paneled, mahogany, beautiful, beautiful. Main salon. On both sides of the main salon, there were library shelves, and there was a tradition through all the various owners of Morning Star from 1927 that wherever they went in the world, they bought books on the local places, and it made the most extraordinarily interesting reading to be able to just pick one of these books up and read. Here's Morning Star re-rigged to Ketch. Richard Ream, who bought her in the 1940s, wanted to take her in the Honolulu race, 1949. So we re-rigged her. Everybody calls her a Ketch, but if I've looked at we had a model made of this boat, and by all definitions, she's a yawl. But the media and everybody else have called her a Ketch. It's pretty hard to stop calling it. And here she is, finishing the 1955 Honolulu race. You can see Diamond Head in the background, and she beat her 1949 record. So she set 2 records on the Transpac. These 2 guys, Fuller Calloway on the left, who was the owner and skipper and was an absolutely first-rate guy to sail with, and Peter Horn, who's here today. I put these 2 guys up because they're my heroes, because these 2 fellows got washed overboard at the time of the wreck, and they went through hell. I was lucky enough to get a phone call from Fuller Calloway inviting me to be on the racing crew for the 1963 transatlantic race from Newport, Rhode Island to the Eddystone Light in England. And then when he found out I was just graduating from the University of British Columbia earlier than American schools do, so I was getting freed up in May. and Fuller needed some help bringing the boat around to Newport, Rhode Island, and he called me and said, "Hey, would you do that?" And I said, "When do you need me?" And he said, I can't remember the date. And I said, "Oh no, that's my graduation." And as I said that, I thought, "Oh, you stupid guy, shut up, say yes." This picture with the red line is superimposed on just a normal sort of National Geographic map. And it shows the course that we set from the breakwater on the Caribbean side of the Panama Canal up to a point on the northwest tip of Cuba, around the Keys and up the east coast to Newport, Rhode Island. Before we got to Panama, though, I have to tell you, we had a series of problems with the engine, different things happening, and it was really exasperating for Fuller because he had everything tuned up for this trip. So we had to put in 3 times. We had to put in Manzanillo, we had to put in Acapulco, and we had, in the middle of the Panama Canal in Gatun Lakes, the engine just quit. Not a good place to be without an engine. So we were getting delayed. In Acapulco, while we were there for about a week, we had to wait for parts to come in, everything. We started getting phone calls from people, or some way they were getting a hold of us, because it had been reported in the media that the U.S. Coast Guard had received a mayday from a sailing yacht named Morning Star with 5 crew aboard in the area of the northwest sector of Cuba. The U.S. Coast Guard checked all the Morning Stars they knew about, including us. All were accounted for. Now, that doesn't mean that some unregistered Morning Star couldn't have gone down. We'll never know. But absolutely no debris was found. No survivors were found. And there developed an opinion that this was at the time of the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba, as you may remember. It's 1963, John F. Kennedy president. And the area where this vessel said it was going down, it was sinking, was pretty close to where we would have been had we not had these delays with the engine. Spooky. Anyway, I just tell you that because there are all kinds of twists and turns in this story. In the lower part there, you see where the big letters for Barranquilla on Colombia. If you just take your eye just to the left and up a bit, you'll see I de Providencia and I, meaning Isle, San Andres. Our course was to take us, the channel between the 2 islands was 26 miles wide, and we set a course to go right up the middle, so 13 miles on either side. Navigation was by sextant, stars and sun, dead reckoning, which is speed times hours, and a compass course. That's it. That's the way it was in those days. So we thought that 13 miles on either side should be okay, but we were a little bit worried because the sailing directions, which was sort of the Bible for offshore mariners going into strange waters, the sailing directions warned us of a strong westerly set in that area, the lower area of that course we had. And so in the first 18 hours out of Panama, we calculated that we had a stronger set to the west than the sailing directions indicated, because they gave a range. So we made a slight adjustment, a more adjustment on the course to compensate. We were to leave San Andres to our port and Providencia to our starboard. So we left Panama at 7 o'clock at night on June 17th on that course. I think it was 330, and off we go. The wind picked up. We got pretty good strong winds, which we were delighted to have because we were late and we were worried we were going to miss the transatlantic. So we're just zooming along. Big seas, good winds that night and most of the next day. So now that's the 18th. Afternoon of the 18th, the winds went down, but all the lumpy seas stayed. Night comes on the night of the 18th and morning of the 19th. No moon, pitch dark. I mean, absolute pitch dark. And we're used to sailing in tropical waters, and we're familiar with seeing these squalls, tropical squalls that are just inky black. I mean, it's just blacker than black. So we noted, I had noted it in my logging of the depths and observations, and Fuller Callaway did the same, that there was a really big squall on our port. We were looking and looking and looking for a lighthouse that was on the southern tip of Providencia, and also trying to pick up the radio positioning beacon coming from the same location. Well, we found out later that neither of them were working. As far as we're aware, we're on course, 330. We know what speed we've made. We know how many hours we've been going. So our dead reckoning still had us between the two islands, in other words, Providencia on our starboard. Well, between our noon sight on the 18th and just after 2 in the morning, the current shifted, and all it would have taken would be a 1 knot shift to take us 14 miles in 14 hours. So we'll never know, but the assumption is, how did we screw, of course we said, how on earth did we screw up this navigation? And the best we can come up with was that we trusted the sailing directions a bit too much. But I don't know how, you guys are all sailors, you know what it's like. You can't tell whether you're getting a set to the east or the west. And hopefully your aids to navigation will help you. Well, there weren't any. They should have been there, but they weren't. We had a rule on the Morning Star, and when you joined the crew, Fuller would train you that if you hear 3 bells, there was a buzzer system that went throughout the cabins below. 3 rings is on deck now. No matter what you're doing, what you're wearing, get up now. But it could be a sail change, or urgent sail change, or who knows what. Well, what had happened was Fuller had asked all the watch captains to log the depth every 15 minutes. That's a quite aggressive procedure, because we were aware of the reefs on both Providencia and San Andres. We wanted to use that as an early warning if we started to see shallower water than we should have. Because where we were going to go, there was lots and lots of water. Fuller had just written into the 2 o'clock log no bottom, which meant the fathometer exceeded our range. And he said, all's well. A minute after that, while he was still putting his books away, he just happened to look at the fathometer again, and he watched the fathometer go from no bottom up to about 2 fathoms, 12 feet. So tapped on the thing, no, it didn't budge. And just then, we just grazed a reef. We didn't bash it, we just skimmed right over it. It didn't stop our forward progress. Here's a nice picture of the magnitude of this vessel and the power of her. And there's the map. The red dot is where we hit. So if you can imagine that we're coming up from the bottom of that chart, and we're probably running parallel to the island and the reef. And we must have been awfully close. If we hadn't had the engine on, we would have heard the surf. So the skimming over the little reef was right up by that dot. Fuller hit the bell. In 2 years of crewing on this boat, I never heard it rung. And I was in my bunk, I was sound asleep. Peter Horn was in his bunk, but he was wide awake. He heard Fuller pull the throttle back on the engine, and he thought, that's very odd. There must be something. So he hopped out of his bunk before the alarm bell. Of course, McDermott's still sound asleep. And I heard the bell, and just boom, on deck. We all the rest of the crew on deck, and all of us were bare feet, shorts or underwear. That's it. No shirts, because hot and humid. Get on deck. Fuller yells at us, we're in shallow water. I don't know which way to turn. What can you see? So I started to head, I was going to go right up to the bow pulpit and see if I had a better visibility out there. I think I made 2 steps forward, and suddenly in front of me, looking at the bow pulpit, behind it came the back end of the biggest bloody wave you have ever seen, and a frothing white at the top, and it was higher. I mean, Morningstar had a 12-foot keel, don't forget either, like that, and it just lifted this 100-ton, 98-foot steel-hulled vessel up like a surfboard. And just we accelerated and went up and over the reef, and we weren't scratching the reef at all at this point. Up, over, and then when the wave broke, nothing to support Morningstar, she came down, she made a noise that was greater than the loudest thunderclap you've ever heard in your life. It was horrible. It was really awful. So we hit, when the wave broke and receded, there was nothing to hold the boat up. She fell over on her beam side, port side down. Mainmast broke at both spreaders. Two sections came down. So rigging now running diagonally across the deck, sails ripped, slobbering all over the place. And then the second wave, the first wave put us on the reef. Then the second wave came along. Our deck is now on about a 50-degree angle. We hadn't had a chance to think about another wave. And we were quickly introduced to it when it arrived, because that deck at that angle was right on the surf break. So the waves came, boom. And now I'm going to turn it over to Peter Horn to tell you what "foom" means.
In order for me to tell what happened, for my case, we ought to make this room pitch black. I had come off watch at 8 o'clock. Brian went on watch. And then when he came back at midnight, he told me, because I was still awake, I was restless, it was a heavy sea, I was jammed up against the bunk boards, and I said, geez, I gotta get to sleep, because my watch comes on at 4, and I'll be pretty tired when the time comes. So he told me they had been on soundings, like he just told you, and he thought that they were by the islands. I was trying to get to sleep, as he said, and all of a sudden, I felt this unusual bump of a ship. If everyone, you know what happens, you think it's a cross wave or something, but shortly thereafter, full of reduced power, and that startled me big time. So I jumped out of my bunk in my underwear and bounded up the companionway. I said, Fuller, what do you have? What's wrong? And I remember his voice for all my living days. Peter, we are in shoal water if this thermometer is right. Can you see anything? I was on the weather rail looking out into the dark, and because there's a squalls I saw rain, I saw the froth of breaking waves, and then I looked up and I pointed my finger up and I said, Fuller, my God, look at that. And it was that huge breaking coma coming down on the vessel. I started to hold on, and I got washed down when the first wave hit down towards the dinghy cradle, and then crawled back up, and then the second wave came through, and Plotzy Miller, one of the hands, was standing in the companionway, and he was yelling, Fuller, turn around, turn around. Well, Fuller already had the helm way over trying to do a reciprocal course. But then a next wave hit, and they said, the dinghy. And we had a 15-foot Boston whaler in a deck cradle, and it was being breaking loose. And so I started crawling for the dinghy to try to put a line on it. And the next breaking wave took me and the dinghy overboard. The dinghy was upside down. I was under it, and all the dock lines and so forth I was kind of tangled up in them. And my eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see a thing, and I was just kind of struggling to get out from under it. And eventually I did, and I felt air in my face. I took a deep breath, and then the seas broke again, and I went underwater.
When Peter and Fuller disappeared, it was a really horrible moment because we were shouting, hearing nothing back. But of course, we all know what the roar of surf is like. It's very noisy. Just on any beach, it makes a lot of noise, let alone hitting on a boat.
I was trying to swim away from the coral because I kept bouncing onto it. And it's a razor bone coral, a cathedral coral. And it's like grabbing hold of razor blades when you're trying to go by it. And it was tough stuff. And when I came up, I was swimming away, and I found a 2x6 just floating by that I grabbed hold of, and it was an act of Providence helping me out, and I held on to that for a while. I yelled, I thought was in the direction of the ship because it was black, and I hear a voice behind me, and it's Fuller. And he yelled back, and we both yelled to get together. And he told me to come over towards him, and he was higher on the reef, and these big high coral heads sticking up. And I went over there with him, and we were there we were out there 2 hours, but we were holding on, and every time the seas would break, it would break you away because the coral couldn't hold you, and we were getting cut up every time. But then all of a sudden we saw the searchlight. So for the first time in the night, it was like a lighthouse. Brian was trying to find us, and we saw the light back on the ship, and we could tell that we were being washed down the reef further. So we worked together to get higher on the reef and then work towards getting in the lee of the ship. And eventually, we said, we got to try to get home. I was beginning to feel chilly after being out there a while and getting tired. And so we started crawling and swimming, trying to get towards the vessel. We could see the Morning Star was no longer coming in on us, and started swimming and crawling. All of a sudden, a parade of combers came in and washed us back further than we were to start with. So we rested and thought about it. And then we could see, they had the searchlight on the life ring they'd thrown on a line that went from the stern. And we decided that, well, this is our chance. Well, we have the strength to swim for that lifeline. When the wave went out, when the wash went out, we went with it. I swam as hard as I could with my hands way up as I was swimming. And I came across that line, and it might have been a 3/4 background line, but I bet I squeezed it down to 1/4 of an inch.
Peter and Fuller found each other. They had been yelling at us, and we never heard it at all, even though we were really listening for it. But the smart guys came together, and their combined voices we did hear. Hallelujah. They're alive, and we could, with the spotlight, handheld spotlight, we found them. We had thrown a life ring with a long rope attached to it, and Plotzy Miller, who was the biggest, strongest guy in the crew and also the professional skipper, threw it as far as he could, and it was only half the distance, and there was such a strong current in there, it took it completely in the wrong direction. So once we saw they were moving towards us, we illuminated the life ring so they would know where it was. And Peter mentioned that they finally got to it and came aboard.
They yanked me, and Fuller was right behind me. So there we were, all 5 crew members, and we were safe. I mean safe. That's what we felt like, even though we were on the seas breaking everywhere. Platzi Miller says, Peter, try to crawl into the galley and get some vinegar and try to put it all over your cuts. Well, would you believe the ship was over and there was some dry paper towels, and I found a big gallon jug of vinegar and I put it all over me, and I can tell you, you knew it. And then I laid down, I took a nap. I was up against the bulkhead, and the seas are breaking over us and the roar's on, and I just took a nap.
So now what to do? Well, we haven't a clue where we are. Obviously, we're off course, but which way are we offshore? Off course. Are we offshore to port, to starboard, what's what? We had to wait for dawn, so we did. By this time, the waves had gone down to the point where they were not sweeping over our deck anymore, and the boat was not moving anymore, so we all went down below. One of the things we noticed was when the surf came in, it was lifting the boat a little bit, and then when the surf would retreat, it would go back down and grind into the coral, and we thought, oh my God, maybe they've been sucked under when the boat comes up, and they're crushed. And that wasn't too great for morale, because we figured we were next, and what do we do about this? Well, the obvious place would have been to go below. But the steel plates on the downside had all ruptured. The diesel fuel tanks had ruptured. So there was an ungodly mess of seawater and mixed with diesel fuel throughout the beautiful salon I told you about before. But we were very scared that the boat was moving. Each time a wave came in, it would get pushed a little further on the reef. Well, we had no idea what the shape of the reef was. If it was a narrow piece of coral, which it could well have been, we might have been pushed off it and go down, into deep water, and the boat would have gone down so fast, anybody down below would never get out. So we decided we're not going there. But then there was another moment of dilemma, because when these waves would come in, for the 3 of us still on board, we could hear it coming, which was good, and then you'd grab something and hold on like hell. But what would happen is the force would lift your whole body up, and it would be almost sort of parallel to the deck. And then when the wave retreat, bang, down you'd come on your bum, on your hip, on whatever. And this was not fun. We had our life jackets on. So we said, what do we do now? Maybe these life jackets are making us so buoyant. It's causing us to be thrown up and then thrown down, and maybe we should take them off. We decided we'd keep them on because we thought it's just a matter of time before we're so fatigued that we end up going in the drink, and we better have our life jackets on. When the dawn came, we came up on deck, and we looked south. We looked everywhere else first, and then south, where we saw absolutely nothing except ocean, and then south, and we saw an island. And by process of elimination, we determined that it was Providencia Island, and that we were about 10 miles up the reef. Okay, that's progress. The severity of the cuts that Fuller and Peter Horn endured was such that they really needed medical care. And so we decided we would abandon ship. We had no idea whether there were people there or not. We had no idea if there were people, where they were. Was there a village? No, charts didn't show anything. Sailing directions didn't say anything about this island. But how are we going to get there? Because the dinghy went overboard. And we thought it was halfway to Nicaragua by sunup. Well, here's another quirky thing in this story. In all the sailing I did on Morning Star, the standard operating procedure when you left harbor, where you would put the dinghy over the side and used it, and you brought it back on board, you took the outboard off the transom and you stowed it up in the forecastle. Always. When we left Panama, we didn't do it. We didn't think about it. We didn't even notice that the outboard was still on there. Amazing. The very fact the outboard was on may well have saved our lives, because what had happened when it went over the side, it flipped upside down, and yes, the current took it away a bit, but only a bit, and the outboard jammed up to coral heads and it stayed there. So we found the dinghy. Oh boy, oh boy. So we got the dinghy. The outboard was so mangled we had to get a hacksaw to get it off the transom. The oars were gone, the seats were gone, da-da-da. Okay, survival gear, and you take what you can wear. That's it. Except for one thing. Fuller, being the wonderful gentleman that he was, said to all of us as we were about to leave the boat, he said, "Lads, I want each of you to take one of the silver goblets that we have our wine out of every night for dinner." I still have mine, Peter still has his. Off we go. Well, 10 miles to some of you hardy sailors may not sound like a lot, but it's a long paddle. As you may have noticed, Boston whalers were not designed to be paddled. They're not even too well to be rowed. And they have a low freeboard. So we get 5 guys and all our survival gear, 2 sextants, shotgun. We cut some sail to catch rainwater, because we were well aware that if the current caught us, we might be heading towards Providencia, but being pushed out to the west. And the next stop was Nicaragua, 150 miles away, and there isn't a chance we would have made that. So we paddled for 10 minutes and bailed for 5, paddled for 10 and bailed for 5, all day long, staying as close as we could to the lee on the reef. So as we're approaching Providencia, maybe we're a mile off at the most, we spotted a outrigger sailing canoe, and the sails were made of flour sacks, very colorful sails. And first reaction was, yippee, there's people here. And second one was, this guy's going to know where the village is, because we so easily could have come in there and gone on the outer sort of the northeast corner there, and there's nobody there, and we wouldn't have known that there was a village around the point. We never could have gotten there because there were mountains that came right down to the ocean. The guy sees us, and he changes course, and he's coming at us. So we're practicing our Spanish to say something about, can you help us? Is there a village? Or I never would have thought to ask him for a tow, because I couldn't imagine that one of those things could tow our weight and that kind of hull. So the guy comes up, and he says, in a 350-year-old version of English, "Can I help you, man?" So we couldn't do a mayday from Morningstar because the VHF antenna was on the main mast, which came down. So nobody knew we had trouble. And there was absolutely no communication facilities on the island. There was no electricity, there was no telephones, there was no telegraph, there was nothing. There was no regularly scheduled transportation in or out. There certainly were no airplanes. The only thing that they could say we should look forward to was the inter-island trading schooner that turned up whenever it felt like it. So that could be next week, next month, 3 months. Then we found 2 Colombian army guys that had been posted there to maintain their claim on the island for Colombia. So we asked the guys to send a message out to the U.S. Coast Guard. Nope, can't do that. Why not? He only had a crystal to go to the naval base in Barranquilla, Colombia. I said, fine, How about telling them? Oh, well, you know, that's not what we do. And we, you know, we were getting exasperated. And we did have a shotgun. And we did think it would be pretty simple to take these two guys under control. But we luckily decided that maybe that might not be a good idea. It might have made our dilemma a lot worse. So we just used charm instead, and they managed to get a message out. But then the next problem was they refused to stay and man the Radio Shack to see if it responds. So we said, well, we'll man it. Oh, you can't do that. Oh, thought about the shotgun again. No, better not. So, all right, as far as we know, a message has gone out to Barranquilla. And what's Barranquilla going to do with it? Probably nothing. How do we get off this place? Well, little did we know, when that signal was sent to Barranquilla, the Marine pilot who took us through the Panama Canal, and all vessels have to be taken through by a pilot, he was a really good guy. He just happened to be in the U.S. Coast Guard radio room in the canal zone, and he heard this message intercepted. It was all in Spanish, but this guy spoke Spanish, the Coast Guard guys did too. And he said, Morning Star, I just took them through the canal. They're good guys. And he went to the Coast Guard and said, what are you going to do about it? They said, oh, we're not going to do anything. Nobody's dead. It's not an emergency. Now, the way I see it is once you're dead, and there is no emergency. So, but you know, we've got 5 guys here who all pay taxes to support the Coast Guard and the Navy and all that stuff. And we're all injured, 2 really badly injured. And they won't come get us. Well, this pilot was so enraged on his own initiative, he went and chartered a twin-engine Grumman Mallard amphibious plane, which means it can land on water and land. And he knew the signal came from Providencia, so that made it easy. Just zip up to Providencia. We don't know this. So Platzi Miller, the professional skipper, and I were out walking on the beach in front of the house where we were all staying. And there were no motorized anything on this island. Nothing. No motorized boats, cars, nothing. But we thought we picked up a sound that was like a motor. So I said to Platzi, stop, see if you hear this. And we were looking around, looking up, couldn't see a thing. But it was getting a little bit louder, And then finally we saw a little speck up in the sky. I thought, wonder what that is. And then the speck was descending, aha. And then we saw wings, ooh. Then she's really coming at us. So Platzi and I took our shirts off like they do in the movies, you know, and we're going jumping up and down. And he wagged his wings. And then we knew he was coming for us. He made a perfect landing in the lagoon, drove right up on the white sand beach where we were standing. I ran up to the house and got Peter and Fuller and the other guy. And I said, we're going home, guys. Gathered our gear, gave the Boston Whaler to the nice family who took care of us, and got in the plane. The pilot took us out to the site of the wreck, and we circled it 3 times, and I couldn't look the 3rd time. I just couldn't. It was just unbelievable. You know, here went a utterly magnificent, beautiful, fast boat, and a chance at setting a transatlantic race record, which is what we really, really wanted. And so then he takes us to Panama. We all go to the hospital. Everybody gets patched up. Fuller very generously took us all to his family estate in LaGrange, Georgia, where they lived. And we had R&R, and we were spoiled silly. Fuller's mother just took such incredibly good care of us. I mean, she was just a beautiful lady. And I think we were there for 3 or 4 days. And then the New York Yacht Club got a hold of us and invited all the crew to be their guests at the start of the transatlantic race that we were going to miss. So we went. And Fuller got a berth on Ondine and did the race. And they set a record. Very nice. We would have beaten Ondine, by the way. And we went home. A few years later, when itinerant sailors went to Providencia, and either they'd heard about the wreck or they just stumbled on it. So this is what she looked like. I don't know exactly the year, but it would be sort of 3 years after, 2 or 3 years after, and she's pretty well stripped, which is fair game. We abandoned, and it was probably the biggest economic shot in the arm that island ever had. And there she looks. You can see it's not much water, and you can imagine how big that wave was to lift us right up onto that shallow reef. Now this one, you may see in the distance a bit of a lump, a little darker area. That's Providencia Island. That's what 10 miles looks like. It was when we went to San Andres Island first. We flew into there. We went to San Andres first, spent one night. Wasn't a very interesting island. We did a tour around. For some reason, our son Patrick thought we should stop at this place. And then, you get in a case of denial or I don't know what, but when we went in the San Andres airport, and I saw that there was actually a check-in counter for Providencia, it was just unbelievable because this was a place that was impossible to get to. And now you could take a daily flight on a twin-engine de Havilland Twin Otter, which is a good aircraft. The pilot got the story of why we were going there, and he gave us a complete circumnavigation around the island, and we saw it. It was a very, very emotional moment. And there's the village where we came in, and the propeller is hiding the house where we stayed, and the Mallard went right up on the beach just after the lower prop. And this is when it's hitting me. I was in a complete state of amazement that here we are 35 years later, and it's actually, I've been dreaming of this for years, and it's actually happening. Oh my God. There's feet on the ground. Giselle, our daughter, and me coming out the door, and Patrick's taking the picture. Minutes after we arrived in this place, minutes after, we go into the little village, and our taxi, which was a pickup truck with 2 wooden benches in the back, and Giselle was sitting in the front, I'm in the back with the kids. I have to run into the airline office to reconfirm, and the guy driving the taxi asked Giselle, "What are you Canadians doing down here? Canadians, nobody comes here." So Giselle told him, he said, "Oh, Morningstar." Oh, and he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw this guy. And he said, "There's Samuel Taylor, the fisherman. This is the guy that was driving the outrigger canoe that towed us in." So here we are minutes later. And I had been wondering whether I'd ever find anybody that knew anything about the Morningstar. Well, holy smokes, were we ever in for some big surprises. So big hug for we found a guy that had taken the mainsail and a whole bunch of stuff and had basically redesigned the interior of his house, which was wonderful. Good for him. And he made me close my eyes, and he came out with this wad of sail. He put it in my hands, and I said, "It's the mainsail off the Morningstar." I knew it for sure because it was really thick Dacron. I always used to take the skin off your knuckles when you're trying to furl it. We hated that stuff. I mentioned about the secret way through the reef. That interesting blob is called Morgan's Head, after Henry Morgan. What you do is from out at sea, you find that. And then you find that cleft in the mountain. And there's your range marker. So you line up Morgan's Head with the cleft, and the front door is now open, and you come right through into this perfect lagoon for anchorage. So finally the wind went down after we were there, and we were able to go out on a small speedboat driven by a fisherman who knew where the wreck was. So out we go. That's our first sight. Well, we didn't know whether we were going to see anything above water. So this was a thrill. We thought, oh my God, this is really fantastic. Again, there's Providencia, 10 miles out. There's the aft end of the pulpit, thanks Noel, sticking out. There's the underwater part of the pulpit, and I've got a stanchion in my hand that I took back to the skipper, Platzi Miller, who was just a terrific guy. I had to put it in a freshwater tank for 3 months because otherwise it just would have turned to dust. And this is amazing. This was the cowling off the famous outboard. It's plastic. You know how thin and flimsy they are. Well, it had jammed in coral heads and didn't go anywhere for 35 years of hurricanes and God knows what. And we found it. There's Patrick and I standing on the wreck. And this is the return trip in the speedboat. I recommend this was a much better way to go from point A to point B to Providencia. A lot faster and a lot more comfortable. When we did our last tour around the island, we saw this canoe, came to a grinding stop. We couldn't believe our eyes. So we feel pretty good about the fact that Morning Star is going to be remembered on Providencia Island for a very long time to come.